Lee Rainie, director of the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life Project, and I just have come from giving a keynote address at lunch today. I talked about a couple of things. The first is I talked about the three revolutions that have occurred in technology over the course of the life of my project. We've been in existence for 10 years. We've watched the internet broadband revolution unfold, we've watched a mobile revolution unfold, and we've watched a social networking revolution unfold. So I gave some new data. 78% of Americans are now internet users, 93% of teenagers, about 61% of people have broadband at home, and they're really different users from the way they used to be in the early part of the last decade. As people moved from a dial-up to broadband environment, they became heavier internet users. They liked what they saw more. They did more things. They spent more time online. They watched a lot of video. And they became content creators. About 2/3 of adults and 3/4 of teenagers now have shared their content in the online space. Sometimes it's not profound. It's just little things and little updates or little comments and things. But they have found ways now to gather a little audience and to tell their stories and try to influence people. So that's revolution number one. The mobile revolution now is 57% of people connect to the internet mobilely, either on their smartphones or on a tablet computer or a portable laptop. Yeah, that's changed people's relationship to information because they can get it anywhere, anytime, on any device. And it's made them even more avid media producers because they shoot pictures and videos and can tell their stories on the fly wherever they are. And it's made real-time information, you know, absolutely getting information at the moment where they are under the circumstances that they find themselves. That's been a big part of the story. It's not appointment media anymore. People set their own appointments with media. The third revolution is the social networking revolution now, and about half of Americans belong to social networking sites, maybe about 2/3 of internet users do. And networks are important because they act as filters for people. They act as early warning systems about what information is important and how to pay attention to it. They act as evaluators of information. They tell people what's right and what's wrong and what's important information and what's trivial information. And they act as an audience. You know, now that people can gather a crowd for their own media, it matters to them that their social networks will pay attention to their postings and their comments and their videos and things like that. So these are all changed the audience measurement space in enormous ways.
Staying with the social media, I mean, I know people are researching and trying to figure out whether we as humans are more individualistic or kind of have a herd mentality. So can you talk about any findings you're seeing that, you know, talk about, is there a difference between whether I see a you know, online banking company's ad, or I see it because my friend tweeted about it, or they sent me to an article where the ad was, you know, side of site next to that article?
Networks have become the central way now that people assess information, assess products, build reputation, find friends, find romantic partners, find jobs. Their importance has risen over time because big institutions, big organizations, hierarchical structures, as well as tight-knit networks, you know, only your closest friends and family, are less important or less meaningful to people because they live apart from groups and they live now more in networks. So any information that's transferred through a person's social network tends to have more value than if it comes from a more impersonal source or a more distant source. But another thing that's happening, of course, is that organizations are finding ways to become sort of active nodes in people's networks. They can be participants. They have to give up a little control. It's not like they can pronounce a message and then walk away from a conversation. They have to be interacting and in conversation with people in networks, which is a really different model of communication than the one that existed in the mass media age. But it's a way for them to take advantage of some of these new tools and find pathways to people to tie with their behavior and things like that. It's interesting to see that the people who are most active on social networking sites also are very robust in their social worlds. In other words, they haven't transferred real, meaningful experiences for diminished, less important, less meaningful virtual experiences. They marry them. And so social networking sites in particular have helped people grow their networks, diversify their networks, find new people to add to their networks. And so it's a situation where networks are more meaningful and are now easier to assemble than they ever have been before.
So we've talked about social networks generically. Is there any nuance between, on a granular level, between audiences as well as types of things people are sending you to? So an audience could be, you know, are guys who are into sports, and we just had the NBA Finals, are they more tweeting about it? Are they more Facebooking about it? Are their friends responding more to one medium versus another?
There is interesting variance in the way that people use social networking sites. Facebook is far and away the most popular and important site, but interestingly, over recent years, it has become an older population. This median age of adult Facebook users has gone up about 5 years in the past couple of years.
So what's the median age now?
It's 38 now, and it used to be 32.
Okay.
But it's an interesting way that it's become now very much a mass media space, whereas Twitter is still a very small segment of the population. It's 13% of internet users, so it's not trivial, but it's not nearly the magnitude of Facebook, which is over half of internet users now are Facebook members. And so for transferring information, people do sort of segment different parts of the internet or different communications patterns for different types of information. It's not so much that they choose social media platforms that way, but they will tweet some things that they wouldn't necessarily call on the phone about. They'll text some things that they wouldn't necessarily tweet. They'll put on Facebook some things that they wouldn't necessarily bother to tweet. And so there's an interesting complexity now to communications patterns that there didn't used to be before, when you had, you know, you could talk to somebody or you could call them. That was your option. Now you've got a lot of different ways to interact with people, and different people have different expectations. You know, younger people won't do email anymore unless they're ordered to, and things. So it's a more complicated world now to figure out for companies and for ad agencies which messaging strategy sort of breaks through the circles of communication that people have surrounded themselves with.
So you had also mentioned broadband internet and mobile, and I think within mobile you now have wireless broadband. So I think the implications of all of that are you can send much more rich media content. So can you talk about trends that you're seeing, I guess specifically in video across kind of internet and mobile?
The video mobile story is still emerging. It's still, the networks aren't incredibly fast yet. The devices and the screens themselves, while they're powerful and they're vivid in their way, are not quite what we know they're going to be in a couple of years. And so as bandwidth increases and the screens get even more pixelated, the media experiences that people will have in mobile environments are going to be pretty rich, and in some respects will potentially, for some users, supplant their wired experiences or their cable experiences, because first of all, they can enjoy it whenever they want and however they want it. Secondly, in some cases, it's a lot less expensive to get it wirelessly over an internet site that charges you a couple of bucks a month rather than paying a fairly hefty cable bill. And so there are all sorts of ways that this space gets transformed and that the media experience of handheld devices gets a lot richer over time. Right now, it's still early adopters. It's young, tends to be guys with a bunch of education and a bunch of money, and it doesn't look like the rest of the population. And my guess is that 5 or 6 years from now, it'll be much more diversified for age, for race and ethnicity, for gender, for all the ways that you know, populations, once they democratize, look more and more like the regular population.
So now let's talk about video online.
Video online is one of the great advances that broadband brought to the online experience. Right now, about 78% of internet users consider themselves to be regular video consumers online. On any given day, about a quarter of internet users are consuming video online. It's certainly not the levels of mainstream broadcasting or cable systems, but it's becoming more and more important to people, in part because of the social experience of it. Many people watch video online because it's been referenced to them by people in their network. They will send a link in an email, they'll post a link on their Facebook page, and that's the way that interest is drawn in all kinds of video, both the professionally produced stuff, but some of the amateur stuff that is such a charming part of the online experience. And video now is, in terms of traffic flows, is now overtaken text and sort of text-based and color-based traffic. It's still in all more people email than do anything else, but the experience of the internet is much more dominated by video now than it ever used to be, and will get so even more in the future.
Just to clarify that point, do you mean more bandwidth or
more bits.
Hours of content viewed?
Well, more hours of content viewed. It doesn't take usually as long to write even a long email as it does to watch a movie or watch a TV show that you care about. So both in time use, but also in the volume of bits traveling through the bandwidth, the video now is a dominant part of the internet, and dominant and growing. Text is receding as it used to be the dominant way that communication and information and media were exchanged online. That's not the case anymore.
In terms of news and information, so what's going on in the Middle East or the financial crisis here, sports stories, can you talk about how people are discovering news content as well as consuming that content? So how they're discovering it and where they're consuming it?
A lot of the discovery is now taking place through social networks. We know people, particularly younger people, who tell us that they wake up in the morning and they log on to Facebook or Twitter and get recommendations. They follow what their friends are following or watch what their friends have already viewed, and will click on the links in the tweet or in the wall posting. There are a lot of people now who are media grazers. Instead of living by appointments with media, the newspaper on your front stoop in the morning, the radio broadcast at the top of the hour, the TV newscast at a set hour of the night, people are now watching the news on their schedule. They're in charge of the news playlist in the way that they're in charge of their music playlist now. And so they're much more likely to be grazing at times of the day when it makes sense for them and when it matters to them, and they're not necessarily living by the appointed times that the media is delivered to them. So it's a big change in people's expectations about what's available and when it's available. It's a big change in their media diet. They're getting a lot more stuff that matters to them rather than stuff that's curated by news companies. And so there's a big challenge now in this environment from a sort of political science perspective of whether people are tightening in on their information bubbles and only encountering information or only encountering people that are like them. That's not a good thing for a polity, and so there are lots of people who are worried about that. One of the great things that the traditional media have always done is delivered to people spontaneous experiences of things that they didn't know that they cared about until they learned about them in a newspaper or on a broadcast. And so those experiences probably are diminishing in the number of times that they happen in this day and age, and there's a reason to worry that as we tighten our filters, that we'll become sort of less attuned to the world around us.
Just playing devil's advocate, do you think that concern is sort of being overblown or over-exaggerated, given that 5-10 years ago somebody politically on the right is having a daily diet of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, somebody on the left is having a daily diet of MSNBC and the New York Times. They're not exactly going too much outside their bubble and their comfort zone 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, I understand that one of the big debates today is technology companies fine-tuning your experience when you hit the homepage of a publication or do a search to show stuff that you've shown interest in or your friends show interest in, which gets to your point of, kind of that myopic, not getting other viewpoints. But haven't we always had that?
It's people have always gravitated to the things that seem more attuned to them and more relevant to them. So this is a very deeply human trait that's played out since media first entered our lives in the cave paintings, probably. There are certain caves that had great paintings for one village and other cave paintings mattered to other villages. So that's a very deeply human trait. What we've found is that it's not so much the people who are actively filtering their environment. The big differentiator is whether people are interested in these subjects at all or not. So it's not red truth and blue truth or conservative truth and liberal truth. It's more people who care about politics get a lot of information, and this is like heaven for them because they can get more from more places and more people and cross-check it and fact-check it and it's just a smorgasbord and they love it. It's the people who don't care about politics in the pre-internet age. They pretty much, if they wanted to watch TV at 6:30 at night, they had to get news. So at least casually they were aware of more things now than people who are indifferent to news. Because they've got people now who are indifferent to news just have lots of other options of how to spend their time with media. They can play games, they can hang out with their social networking friends, they can watch sports, they can check financial sites, and so there's not any great sense that the partisan folks are only getting it from their separate domains. It's a sense that the active people are really separating out now from the inactive and uncaring people, and that's a different kind of concern for the culture. It's mostly, are certain people feeling like they don't now have a place or a voice in politics rather than, the wrong teams in power.
Do you do research around kind of like journalism and what journalists are doing? Because I know, there have been studies coming out recently or questionnaires and surveys of, are you using things like Twitter to verify stories or get primary information or multiple sources of information? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, we've done a bunch of work with our colleagues down the hall at another Pew-funded project that has looked at how people have changed their news diet and their news habits in this environment. One of the most interesting things is that the people who are into news now get it on multiple platforms in multiple ways and multiple times a day now. So if they're in their car, they might be listening to the radio. If they're sitting in their den, they might be reading TV. If they're at work, they'll be checking on their desktop. And so there's partly a time of day and convenience element to this. And a lot of people now are supplementing their media diet with things that they can find online. So if they really care about a subject, they will go to try to find the primary sources, or they will try to get an alternative point of view from the one that seems to be most heavily promoted in the story they've just read. It's not everybody. People are just interested in the news and they want to check in headlines and then check out and move on to other things. But people who really, really care now have tons of alternatives to dig deeper into a story, to go to primary sources, to read alternative points of view. One of the most common things we've seen, particularly on foreign stories, is that Americans will start maybe with basic information about the news story from an American news organization, but then cross-check or amplify what they think they know by going to foreign sources. And there are a lot of people now who sort of by default think, oh, I'm going to check multiple places now to just see how this is playing in Europe or see how it's playing in the Middle East or something like that. So people are a little bit more scattered. News is sort of omnipresent, and they don't necessarily feel like they have to focus on it or devote themselves to it in the way probably their parents and grandparents did. But there are easy ways now to just dive deeply into anything that sort of catches your attention if you care about it.
So in addition to consumers consuming their news, what about journalists who are actually the producers of news content? Are you seeing stuff where they're, now using sources such as Twitter to verify stories and actually, when you check the box of did I fact check this, did I verify this, they're saying in their mind, oh yeah, I got some tweet verification from on the ground there, or Facebook verification or something like that?
There are clearly ways that this has changed the workaday world of journalists. At one level, they are composing their stories, whether it's in a text or video or an audio format, with a much more vivid sense than I had when I was a journalist, that there are people out there watching who are going to pay attention to what I say and what I don't say, and people who are going to be able to go check the primary documents or watch the full press conference or get access to the Twitter feeds that I have had access to as well. And so it's partly a much more upfront, in-your-face sense that you are writing to an audience of real people who are going to critique you when you get done with your project. The second thing is that the journalists are heavily into getting sourcing and comments and tips and amplification of news through citizen journalists. Starting with Katrina and the London bus bombings, there are ways now that people who shot their own pictures and posted them on websites and linked to other people's social media feeds, they became an integral part of the story and were celebrated by mainstream news organizations because they were on the scene, they had more vivid stuff, they were in a better position to talk about what was going on and what the reaction of people around them were. So this one-time war between the amateurs in the news environment, or what used to be the consumers, And the professionals doesn't exist anymore. There's not this sort of war of words between the pro-am communities that there used to be in the earliest days of blogging and stuff like that. But there are definitely ways now that journalists are very comfortable citing the tweets they see, the Facebook posts, the videos, the photos, gathering up comments from people who have shared their stories on Facebook. At sort of publications that pride themselves on fact-checking, where you literally have to hand in a file with all of the documentation about where you found things. This is now legitimate stuff, and in many cases, people their editors might ask, well, can you verify this yet another way? And sometimes, out of Iran or out of the streets of Syria, it might be the only way to cite a voice that seems to be coming from the street, and so it's allowed into print or it's allowed into a broadcast just because that's the best they can do at the time, and they're pretty careful about identifying maybe what its limitations are or the circumstances under which they found some information. But now it's a very integrated world where the user community is very much contributing to the news product. And the other way that this, of course, has influenced journalists' lives is that they now have a sense that they are constantly filing. They're constantly doing things. For a long time, there were segments in the news industry. The wire services would do up-to-date stuff. If there was breaking news during a big breaking news or something, that radio and TV would cover it. But they got away from that as the morning paper didn't become the up-to-date thing about what happened yesterday. People had already seen it on television or heard it on the radio yesterday. Well, now all of a sudden, all news organizations are back in the breaking news business, which is really interesting to see how correspondents respond to that. And there's a lot of encouragement, shall we say, by their bosses for lots of reporters to have blogs and to update their stories through social media.
Actually, I was going to go somewhat in the opposite direction and ask, given that Joe Blow on the ground in Louisiana can take photos on his iPhone of what's going on with Katrina, or pick any other location in the whole explosion of citizen journalism, do you think that changes the role of what a journalist's main function is from just saying what happened to maybe adding some commentary and insight and making sense of it all?
There are some ways now that this new environment has sort of unpacked some of the traditional roles that traditional journalists used to have. And so there are ways now that storytelling is equally as much in the hands of citizens as it used to be in journalists. But sometimes nobody will go cover the city hall meeting or the mayor's event somewhere, and it's, as newspapers in particular and local news organizations are really financially stressed out. That's maybe a gap in local coverage now that didn't used to exist, but now they don't have the resources, or they will say, well, people maybe don't care about this as much or something like that. So there's a real segmenting going on, and different roles of the traditional media are being outsourced to other kinds of people, or they're being traded off with other people. But still, it's important to, I think people still rely on their news organizations to help them sort through what's most important, and still help them be filters for what's the most meaningful, consequential stuff. Help them figure out civic life. Local news organizations in particular know more about local political life than anybody else, including local nonprofit agencies or something like that. So people depend on it for those kind of things. For lots of other things now, the traditional smorgasbord approach of newspapers in particular, but also some broadcasts, will give you everything that you want. Sports is now something that a lot of other organizations do really well. Financial news is something that a lot of organizations do particularly well. It's not necessarily tied to locality. Weather is something that can be localized, but done with big databases pulled together by big sites. So there's a sort of breaking apart of the bundling that used to take place in lots of local news organizations, and pieces of the bundle are now better served for people in other kinds of outfits, but there are some things now that local news organizations are particularly good at.
There's a lot of news within the news industry about hyper-local news, and obviously AOLpatch.com/Huffington Post is the 800-pound gorilla in that space. Is there a sustainable business model for hyper-local news? Maybe AOL Patch has something going, but for somebody who's just in one market, because AOL Patch is we're going to be in every market and have this huge infrastructure that we can kind of, you know, allocate costs across 5,000 markets, whereas Joe Blow from Westport, you know, Connecticut is only in that one market.
It's a very challenging thing. There are lots of hyperlocal organizations that are basically fueled by somebody's passion for it rather than their sense that they're going to make money, or the fact that they do make money. In many cases, they have to hold down other jobs, even while the thing that they most care about is the local activity that they're blogging about or their website is built around. The big variable in this, you know, I think we'll know a lot more in 5 years, is the reaction of the local small business community. You know, right now it's a primary advertising market potentially for hyperlocal news. You know, if I'm the local hardware store owner, or if I've got a print shop, or if I have a shoe store, there are ways now to think that the internet can serve me well. You know, chances are there's a vast majority of your potential customers use the internet and things, but there aren't necessarily robust local websites in that community, and you've advertised in the Yellow Pages forever, or you've advertised on placemats in the local restaurants, or you've got a nice big neon sign outside your store. You know, traditional methods of advertising are something that they feel very comfortable with, and so the willingness of the local merchants and advertising, you know, possibilities, that whether they go for online advertising or not is a big determinant of whether there's a real business model there or not.